Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this was one of those weeks where I've actually been working flat out on my list of the best albums of the 2010s. Hopefully going to be dropping that relatively soon. And yet when you've exposed yourself to that much great music and concentration opposite projects that might not measure up that have dropped recently, well, I'm not going to say my standards got consciously or even subconsciously higher, but I might have wound up a little more focused and nitpicky as a result this week, which is just what everyone wants to hear, so let's get on the pulse. So we've got 7 albums on the docket. Let's start with from Lee Owens' Inner Song. So here's an artist I kept seeing get a lot of critical attention, but I figured within hazy indie pop that leaned more on the electronic side, the odds were not in my favor that I'd be blown away, so I actually wound up skipping Lee Owens' debut album. And going back to it now, I'm not gonna say I was right, but I won't say I was wowed by this either. It's generally likable, tastefully produced, atmospheric, with some likable, burbling tech house grooves, but not a lot that really stood out. And now in her follow-up, well, it feels like an expansion of that sound, but it also doesn't give me a ton to say. I heard some people say that Lee Owens' sound is so minimalist and direct that if the fundamentals don't grab you, might not be for you. You might not be gripped by it. And I think there might be some truth there. I'm not huge into techno as it is, and the stuff I do tend to like is more experimental or melodic, which is why I gravitated more to her ethereal, gentle synth pop tunes with a padded soft focus around her improving vocals. And even then, I wouldn't precisely call them distinctive songs outside of Corner of My Sky, where guest star John Cale delivers some welcome and distinctly Welsh organic texture as his craggy voice will ramble through some free verse describing all the natural world, all amidst a hazy bit of burbling atmosphere that you would expect from her, that it feels very precisely lukewarm. Hell, that might be my greatest frustration with Inner Song. With such spare melody, I'm stuck looking at the textures and that groove that patter and bubble away tastefully. It's certainly an agreeable album to like, but it also feels kind of monochromatic and weirdly flat to me. It doesn't really modulate in the same way. The sort of electronic music that will soundtrack plenty of high-end, subtly tasteful bars and dance clubs when they reopen fully. And while I would not leave if I heard this playing, I'm not sure there's enough to get me to stay here either. 6 out of 10. It'll find its audience, and if that's you, check it out. Next up from Jonas, The Southwest Sky and Other Dreams.
Now he's just the last cowboy at the bowling alley.
Look, I'll be the first to admit I got a really high bar set for Jonas. Oklahoma Lottery was stunningly well written and incredibly textured indie country back in 2014, one of my favorite albums of that year. And while she's expanded her sound and embraced more stylistic diversions, I've been waiting for her to drop a project that can encapsulate the intensity of her writing and the full texture of her sound, especially with her more unique, soft-spoken sultriness that she worked to great effect on 2016's country songs. So now here, it's better than Butter from 2 years ago, but I'm still not all that convinced that Jonas has gotten production that properly flatters and accentuates her delivery, especially here when she's slipping into her breathy upper register and can sound really thin getting there, especially opposite of more burnished and warm soundscape with some of the acoustics, the electric guitar, and some of the pedal steel. But I'll be honest, that's a pretty minor quibble given that that sense of greater detail has slipped back into a lot of her compositions, which will balance out between some traditional country, some splashes of indie folk, and even some rockabilly, and in a lot of her songwriting, which is a lot of wistful, soft-focused reflections on long-lost flings and old memories juxtaposed with, well, the poor reality of the now, and what you can build if you've been left behind but are still trying to dream. And the imagery she evokes is pretty striking, from the old cowboy who's stuck in tradition in the fading bowling alley, to the relationship that's collapsing where everything is being left unsaid and the breaking point is clearly coming on songs like Maybe You'd Hear Me Then. And Jonas is not one to pull punches. She never has been. And by the end of the album, the predominant phrase is how it's all a losing game, a struggle at best. But in one of two precisely timed key changes on the album, the hope is left implied. It's subtext, but it's there. So like with every Karen Jonas album, it's subtle, absolutely a grower, and while I'm not sure it tops her best, it was really rewarding, even in a year with much stiffer competition in indie country. So, light 8 out of 10, worth checking out, for sure. Next up from Pain of Salvation, Panther. Accelerator, accelerator. This is one of those Swedish progressive metal acts that I've been aware of in the scene for years, but haven't really had the inclination to do the full deep dive. And now having done so, my intuition was actually more on track than I realized. Pain of Salvation came out in the wake of the 90s progressive metal revival, with some slightly groovier edges to balance out some stunning guitar work, and their powerhouse of a frontman, Daniel Gildenlau. I mean, it's kind of a shame the writing of any sort of stronger hooks or having anything close to consistent production was something that this band has never managed to master. I don't know, to me they've always felt like a very solid B-tier progressive metal group. Rarely bad, but not quite hitting the heights of some of their peers. And unfortunately, their Turn of the Millennium albums that got close to greatness, they sound a little dated 20 years later, especially with some of the spoken word or borderline rap metal elements, even if I would argue that Remedy Lane is pretty solid, and the two Road Salt albums might actually be better. Unfortunately, in recent years, Pain of Salvation have been hopping on the gent-adjacent trend of really overdeveloping their groove passages at the expanse of a solid hook or a song. And if you thought this was endemic on their last project, The Passing Light of Day, it of course pops up here with a sharper pivot toward buzzed-out, murky electronic rock, complete with some obviously synthetic percussion. Although what gets exasperating for me is that very few of these elements rarely show any sort of heaviness or distinctive texture or even tunefulness, mostly getting subsumed in a lot of muddy downtuning that can't even be all that punishing or abrasive or truly heavy. It bizarrely reminds me of that Boston Manor album from earlier this year, and how it seems like any sort of distinctive tuneful elements have to claw and tear themselves to the front of the mix, and I actually include Daniel Gildenlau's vocals in that, from his affected crooning to where he nearly goes back to his early rap metal roots, which is absolutely a choice he made and leads to some questionable results. I don't know, the best moments they come when the actual tuneful acoustic lines or some of the darker pianos get closer to the front beyond the underwhelming overproduction. I mean, I'm certainly appreciative of a guitar solo that fought its way through on the closing song Icon, which is probably still the best here, but I already see the argument how some of this colorless approach reinforces the album's dystopian themes, where those who are different and who could really impact change, they're marginalized and heavily medicated out of the system. And you know what? At some point, I truly hope bands realize that leeching their sound of any sort of color for the banal dystopia, not only does it feel thuddingly on the nose and cliche, and also not always representative of the more subtle and dangerous elements of authoritarianism, but it also makes the sound really dry and sterile and tired, especially when the text of said dystopia feels so damn cliche, even with all the tacked on animal elements and the stark individualist and misanthropic streak, which only adds more sourness. In other words, yeah, sure, it'll serve the fans and the target audience, but I didn't really care for it. 5 out of 10, they've done better, not their best. Next up from Ulver, Flowers of Evil. Object, wants and desire. Sweet nothings in her ear. This is one of those long-running acts that it was only a matter of time before I discussed them in detail, but Ulver is kind of weird in that lane. They started off in raw 90s black metal, and they actually sounded pretty damn good, but their tones are always a bit warmer, sliding in towards folk, and it was clear they weren't going to stay in black metal. And that happened as early as their second album, which went pure neo-folk, then bouncing back to black metal, which even with the remaster, and despite being really well played, has some shockingly bad production absolutely on purpose too, to a lot of haunted, strangely jazzy trip-hop, but then fusing some of those ideas together, and then going more ambient for 2007's Shadows of the Sun, which I would argue might be their best album regardless of genre. Then came the 2010s, where their sound suddenly actually got a bit brighter, even a bit poppier, but rarely sticking the landing for me with as much unique potency as they could, which also meant I didn't have the highest of expectations going in for Flowers of Evil, and that's probably apt for what we got here, which is leaning very heavily on their 80s synth-pop darkwave side with the gated percussion, the ominous synth work, the darker piano lines, the smoky guitar texture, and a lot of the tighter bass grooves. And yet, if I'm being brutally honest, Ulver's poppy side has always been kind of hit and miss. The hooks do not coalesce, their material can sound very derivative, very fast, and this goes back to their 2000s work too. And while there's enough gothic swell and the occasional quirky groove like on Little Boy with the manic drum work or the bassy rollick of nostalgia, paired with a short enough runtime to keep this from getting tedious, which I appreciate, I'm not really hearing much that knocks this out of the park. Not a lot of great hooks, even if there are a couple good ones. I will say I tend to like Ulver's style of writing and themes though. A fair few songs are collections of abstract imagery and some Bible and literary references, leaning into the creepy juxtapositions between the beautiful and the truly horrifying, from the apocalyptic references to atomic warfare and Waco, and some post-apocalyptic scenes that are referencing Philip K. Dick, to the more primal savagery, calling back to some of their black metal juxtaposition of the terrible beauty, where making a song called Nostalgia reflecting back on some of those roots, it's almost too easy. And yet that's before we get the truly gruesome and rather uncomfortable scenes of Russian Doll and 1,000 Cuts, which reference some child trafficking and the exploitation movie Sallow. I shouldn't have to say more. Look that up if you want to have an idea, just all of the trigger warnings. Honestly, I would say the writing is what pushes this into stronger territory. I just wish the actual compositions took more chances, or felt a little bit more abrasive or experimental or sticky. Very good stuff though, so I will say 7 out of 10. If you're a fan, check it out. Next up from Ruston Kelly, Shape and Destroy.
I remember what my name is now. I cut the water, lay the roadway down. You can call me Moses.
This is gonna sound harsh. There was no way Ruston Kelly's follow-up to Dying Star wasn't going to be an emotional letdown for me. I mean, that album dropped at a low point of burnout and resonated on a fundamental level in late 2018 that's hard for me to contextualize for as raw as it was. Call it emo country, it was a sort of devastation that kind of short-circuited critical faculties in some spaces. And now the inevitable problem is that following that up, given that I'm no longer really in that space, I had to be prepared to take this in a different way. Incidentally, I'm doing a lot of the same mental preparation for when Lydia Lovelace's follow-up Daughter to 2016's Real drops later this year. So, okay, with all that context established, is this still great? Well, I think so, but I will say that Ruston Kelly's vocals have started to slide from haggard to outright nasal and kind of fried, which isn't always as flattering to an album that feels brighter and warmer across a lot of its pickups, especially with the subtle glimmer of arranged elements flushing out the peeling guitars, the chimes, and pedal steel. Although with enough touches to reverb, it does actually work against that hi-hat whirs that crept onto a couple songs here. But you know what? To some level, that makes sense, as Shape and Destroy picks up thematically where Dying Star left off, finally finding comfort with love and being loved and the unceasing pushback against depression that, to quote another excellent album from 2020, gets easier but never gets easy. But while it led to so much unstable anger on Jason Isbell's reunions, I got to applaud Ruston Kelly fighting to keep that newfound optimism and hope, even as every old temptation and craving flits across his vision, all those old demons on his shoulder, where he can even contextualize his past not so much as old demons, but helping shape the man he is now becoming. Now, truly transformative love will do that to you, which means the unspoken reality of his separation from Casey Musgraves shades every moment with a certain quiet tragedy, especially when her voice will slip into the background. And then the comparison that springs to mind, it's more of Jhené Aiko's Chilombo, where she tried to find comfort with every moment of bliss with the quiet knowledge that it was likely all gonna slip away. But you know what? This album's got that same deeper inner focus of comfort and strength that means it's so easy to return to, plus a lot of those devastating moments for good measure. It's comfort listening, and I actually mean that as the highest possible compliment, especially with that stripped down coda of a conclusion that's absolutely goddamn stunning. Now, the album does not have a Blackout or Paratroopers Battle Cry or even a Jericho, and that highlights how this album isn't about to devastate you like Dying Star could. It's a lighter experience, but you know what? There's still enough drama, emotional nuance, and real detail in the writing that will put this over the top for me, even if I had to let this grow on me a bit more. So as such, light 9 out of 10. He's 2 for 2. This will be among the best of 2020. An album for the year. Definitely make time, hear it. Next up from Disclosure, Energy.
Please don't fuck up my high, my high, my high. Please don't fuck up my high, my what? My high. Please don't fuck up my high.
I mean, third time's the charm? Look, I've made it no secret that I've struggled with Disclosure. I thought Settle was intriguing, had solid high points, but never really shone through as consistently brilliant as so many others were gonna say it was. And I thought Caracol was a considerable step down from that, and with Energy 5 years later, I did not have much in the way of expectations at all. And now, having gone through it, honestly is kind of patchy, mostly because of how scattered it feels as a whole. This is one of those cases where you can tell that Disclosure was burrowing a little bit more deeply into slightly older 2000s era house sounds that don't quite punch above a lot of their inspirations. Or hell, in the case of their many guest stars, don't always give them the augmentation or support that they could really use. I mean, look at how stiff their Khalid inclusions are on the deluxe edition of this album. They're the most obvious examples of that, but given I don't review deluxe albums, look at how they seem to defer to Common on the closing track in a rather awkward way. It's a real dud to close out the project. I mean, the Disclosure songs that I've liked have always been where the whip-sharp percussion grooves compose a tight but flexible pockets for the MCs to lock in, which is why Aminé and Slow Tie deliver, and where Mick Jenkins' comfort with this side of electronica, thanks to his work with Kaytranada, it does make a lot of sense that he's here too. Hell, I even like the opener with Khalees thanks to that great bass line, which I did not expect at all. But that also means that leaves them very reliant on their guest stars for the standout moments. And for a project that's reportedly built from the duo recording 200 songs, I gotta say, I'm a little bit surprised they couldn't synthesize a stronger flow or cohesive ideas to hold the album beyond a scattered collection this thematically diffuse, especially when the energy starts to putter out on the second half. I mean, you take away that aggressive percussion and those tighter grooves, I'm not hearing what really differentiates Disclosure from their peers or their influences. Now again, I've never been on the Disclosure hype train from the beginning, and just feeling kind of lukewarm on a lot of the songs here. I gotta say it, still not quite sure I'm there, so 6 out of 10 for the fans, but take it or leave it. And finally, from Katy Perry, Smile.
Takes me back, thought it was done, but guess it's never really over.
There was a part of me that didn't think this was even going to come out. And I don't mean that as a jab, but Katy Perry was struggling to get singles with traction on the radio, which following the half-formed disaster that was Witness and albums that failed to gain traction this long, they can wind up getting shelved or at the very least compromised. But hey, she put it out anyway at the end of the summer, and it's better than Witness? Look, the first thought that came to my mind with Smile is that in some ways it reminded me of Chromatica as a late 2000s pop icon trying to go back to the well to find what works and overcome trauma. And even if it can feel weirdly hollow for both artists, there's always been more of a core to Lady Gaga's sound and personality than we've ever gotten from Katy Perry, whose strengths as an artist has always been tied to the big flashy singles that often owe a lot more to the plastic pop artifice than her unique presence. And you know what? That's fine in pop music, except you get the lingering feeling that Katy Perry still doesn't want to be making pop music, and as you get deeper into this project, that sour undercurrent doesn't really go away, which leads to a darker side to this album that lacks the intensity or complexity to pull me into Katy Perry dancing through the tears. This is an album that desperately wants to have the impact of Robin's Dancing on My Own, but lacks that subversive side of desperate optimism that gave that song so much of its punch. Most because Katy Perry can't even fake having much fun the majority of the time. Or maybe it's how canned and thin so much of the production sounds on this album, especially around a lot of the vocals. Katy Perry has always had a lot more volume than texture or control, and man, it shows here with the compression or the weirdly colorless, wiry mix, which really does not help those moments trying to be more bouncy and optimistic. Hell, I really think only Never Really Over, or maybe some of the splashier horns on Tucked, they get close. I mean, it's certainly better than whenever an acoustic guitar will pop up on this project, or dare I even say the trap percussion. But at the end of the day, I just missed the first half of Teenage Dream. 5 out of 10. Take it or leave it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'll admit, kind of a bit of a weird week as a whole, and I know I may have said a few controversial things, but have fun. Comments down there below. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, feel no obligation to at this time. It's tough for everybody. It only seems to be getting worse in some spots. But hey, if you want to get involved, there's the opportunity. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.